So, welcome to Wise Words, where we read the best non-fiction books so you don't have to. In this episode, we're moving on to book number 8 of our communication book series. So if you're interested in improving your communication skills, then join us on our journey as we do our best to distill the key ideas and practical tips from the best communication books. If you listen to this episode in full, we promise you that you will learn the following 5 things. Number 1, the importance and impact of pausing for effective communication. Number 2, Churchill's CREAM framework to craft the ultimate quotable line. 3 is how to use props to create a presence, and how personal style and choice of attire can influence one's public image. 4 is how to wield quotes effectively by dramatising their presentation and cross-quoting to gain the upper hand. 5, how to immediately sound like a famous orator by turning your prose into poetry using a simple hack. So now sit back and relax whilst we take you through this book chapter by chapter. The book consists of 21 chapters, which each contain one key or actionable idea, so you can start implementing them straight away. So just a quick note on the author. So James C. Humes was an author, obviously an author, and former presidential speechwriter. He was Ronald Reagan's official speechwriter, but also wrote speeches for George H.W. Bush, Gerald Ford, Richard Nixon, and Dwight Eisenhower. He has served as a communications advisor as well to major US corporations, including IBM and DuPont. He is the author of 23 other books, so it's safe to say he's pretty well versed in communication.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, well then jumping into the introduction. So, we are living in the age of the personality cult. This is evident in how magazines like People, a spin-off of Time magazine, outsell their predecessors due to their focus on individuals. Hollywood also recognizes this trend, often relying on famous actors to attract audiences, sometimes regardless of the movie's plot. Leaders who present themselves well, using what James C. Humes calls power talk, tend to be more successful. An example is Winston Churchill, who used his powerful speeches to bolster Britain's morale during World War II, deterring Nazi Germany from invading. The book Speak Like Churchill, Stand Like Lincoln highlights 21 key strategies that can enhance anyone's communication skills, making them more charismatic and effective. These tips range from simple adjustments to learning new speaking techniques, all aimed at giving individuals a more commanding presence, confidence, and influence. And I think it's just interesting how, even the title of this book, very much people straight away resonate with it because Churchill is so well known as this amazing speaker who is witty, able to come out with quips and everything so off the hand. But actually you'll find out that he prepared a lot of his speeches, and the same thing with picking Lincoln, another force in our minds that we consider someone who's very good at speeches and debating, and we essentially they're essentially role models for us in this realm of speaking and communication.
Yeah, and as people who are listening will see throughout this sort of summary, there are lots and lots of quotes, and a lot of them, funny enough, like you just said, have been featured by Churchill and Lincoln. So let's start with the chapter 1 then, which is the power pause. So have you ever wondered how some speakers effortlessly command attention, leaving their audience hanging on their every word? Well, it turns out the answer is quite simple. Just pause. The power pause is a technique that builds anticipation in your audience before you start speaking. This method was used effectively by historical figures such as Benito Juarez and Napoleon Bonaparte, who, despite being short and having accents that could have been seen as disadvantages, they managed to captivate their audiences by pausing before they spoke. Juarez would silently rehearse his opening lines while making eye contact with his audience, creating a silent tension. Similarly, Napoleon would wait quietly before addressing his troops, making him seem larger in their eyes with each passing second. So use silence strategically, as it can make a significant impact, whether you're introducing someone, giving a speech, or answering a question. By pausing before responding to a question, you give the impression that you are thoroughly considering or thoughtfully considering your answer, which can make you seem more wise and considerate. This deliberate silence adds weight to your words and enhances the audience's perception of you as a speaker. Just as a frame enhances a painting by artists like Raphael or Rembrandt, a power pause can set the stage for your speech, making your first words more impactful. So before beginning your speech, try making eye contact with your audience and silently repeat your opening sentence to yourself. This preparation can significantly strengthen the effect of your opening words, helping you command the room. So next time you're giving a sales pitch or even responding to a question during a conversation, consider implementing a thoughtful pause. So now that we've learned the importance of the pause, now it's time for lesson 2.
Yes, so the power opener. Effective speakers begin their talks with a strong opening, avoiding common expressions of gratitude or praise. The initial moments of any speech are crucial as the audience is most attentive and curious about the speaker. Using this time for mundane pleasantries can squander a key opportunity to captivate your listeners. Instead, starting with a compelling personal story that resonates emotionally or humorously with the audience can make a powerful impact. And just relating back to the previous point, by creating that pause, by creating that, that silence, you're almost instilling a bit of uncertainty in your in your audience about what's about to come, and so it builds that tension, it builds that suspense. So if you can then come out with this power opener, something that's really strong and really engaging, well then you've already got your audience in this engaged mood. Now they're ready to take in whatever you're about to say. So I think the two go hand in hand incredibly well. Ready to transform your speeches from mundane to memorable? Discover the power of Winston Churchill's parenthetical praise technique. Winston Churchill noted that offering praise at the start of a speech can seem insincere, like flattery, whereas incorporating praise midway through your speech, a method termed parenthetical praise by Churchill, often comes across as more sincere. This technique counters the predictability of starting speeches with phrases like, "It's an honor to speak to," you know, which can sound cliched and lessen the perceived authenticity of any compliments given. By inserting genuine acknowledgements or compliments in the middle of your discourse, the praise can stand out more strikingly, catching the audience at a moment when they are more engaged and thus making the appreciation more impactful. This approach ensures that the audience perceives the praise as heartfelt, enhancing the overall effectiveness of your communication. And I think that makes a lot of sense. You want to kind of avoid these cliched steps or paths that everyone engages in. You see it so often with all these politicians, where they're just like, "Oh, the honorable gentleman." It's like, that's just literally, you don't give a shit.
It's
You're
a
just saying that
platitude,
as a
like,
pleasantry.
Mm.
So, to grab your audience's attention, invest time in crafting and refining your opening sentence. This power opener should be prepared thoroughly and practiced well. Following a strategic pause, deliver this opening with impact, instantly engaging your audience and setting a dynamic tone for your presentation. And this was something that, Churchill was incredibly good at. And he would constantly refine his, opening statements because if you lose your audience from the get-go, then what's the point? The rest becomes kind of redundant, or you have to work super hard to get their engagement back. But if you can open with such a good, powerful line or story, then you're halfway there. So
For sure.
a power opener is important, and it can be enhanced when combined with chapter 3, which is
3 is the power presence. So, have you ever wondered how iconic leaders like FDR, Churchill, and Stalin wielded their influence beyond mere words? There's just one answer: props. The historical figures mentioned before masterfully used clothing and accessories to create a commanding presence. Each of these leaders chose signature items, such as cigarette holders, cigars, pipes, that not only defined their time, but also augmented their personas. Churchill was particularly adept at this, cultivating a power presence with his choice of a navy blue pinstripe suit, a gold watch chain, and a blue polka dot tie, among other accessories to project authority. Both he and Roosevelt also employed other props like glasses and victory signs to reinforce their public images. The lesson here is to cultivate a personal style that boosts your presence and makes you unforgettable, akin to selecting a star suit for pivotal moments. Opt for attire and accessories that not only reflect your identity, but also leave a powerful and enduring impression. And it kind of reminds me sometimes when, some scientists get that sort of really super frizzy hair, like the Einstein
yeah,
hair. And it's almost part of it is almost to sort of signal that I'm a scientist to some extent. I'm sure they're not doing it on
yeah.
purpose, but they exude that sort of look, don't they, if that makes sense. Whereas if you look too much like a finance bro, you wouldn't be thought of as a scientist.
No, absolutely. And it's interesting, this point, because how much is it us looking back at something retrospectively and being
Yeah.
like, oh, the reason why they were successful was because he happened to wear pinstripe suits, or
Mm,
was it just that he happened to wear that and now he's become iconic for it? But
sure.
in conjunction with that, there is an element of like, like look at Andrew Huberman today. We all
Yeah.
recognize, the long,
Yeah. Yeah.
long sleeve black t-shirts. It's like he is iconic. It's like he stands out now because he has a particular style, and it's
Yeah.
essentially just saying, this adds another
Yeah, yeah,
element.
no, 100%. I get you. Like, yeah, I agree with you. I don't. You're right. You wouldn't say like, for example, if you just put on a polka dot suit, you're basically Churchill now, and you can just speak like he could. Just obviously that's not the point. The point, I guess, like you just said there, is the idea of like repeating something over and over again, so people associate that
Mm,
style or that prop with you.
yeah,
The fact that obviously loads of cigars are now got like a Churchill brand basically built off it. And then you think of like Steve Jobs, he was famous for like turtlenecks
yeah,
and
yeah,
whatnot.
exactly, yeah, yeah,
So there's plenty of It's almost like you need to find something that somebody else doesn't already own as a prop and use it yourself. I mean, uh, within reason, right? If I turn up with like a sort of like a flamingo stick or some shit, people would think you're
yeah,
crazy. But I guess if you're going for that sort of look,
yeah,
then it suits you, right? It's got to kind of fit the persona to some extent.
exactly. Yeah, I want you on the next episode with a flamingo stick. Okay,
Yeah,
I'm gonna hold you
yeah.
to
So
that.
God, maybe that's what that's how we're going to take this to the next level. Iconic for the flamingo suits or books in the buff.
Exactly,
That's the
books
next
in the
one.
buff. Um,
So yeah,
all
go on.
right, so yeah, we've covered the power presence, and now we're moving on to the PowerPoint. So, for any talk or presentation, you must figure out the PowerPoint first. Whether you are going to a breakfast meeting with a potential investor, making a sales talk, or delivering a production presentation, you need to first come up with the key message you want to leave with your audience. Harold Macmillan, which I pronounce correct, who would become Britain's first Prime Minister in the 1950s, asked Winston Churchill what he thought of his maiden address in the 1924 House of Commons. Churchill harumphed, Harold, when you rose, you didn't know what you were going to say. When you were speaking, you didn't know what you were saying. And when you finished, you didn't know what you had said. Which is a great, a great quote. He's just so witty. I mean, imagine just being able to come up with that like off the cuff. Gosh.
And also having the balls to say it, I guess,
Yeah,
as well.
yeah, exactly. Um, Through this criticism, Churchill emphasized how important it is to zero in on the purpose of your message. Churchill was contemptuous of speeches that rambled. Because he was a great speaker, he was once asked whether he really enjoyed listening to other speakers at the various banquets he attended, to which he replied, "There are too many public speeches and too little private thinking," which is also another great little quote. The British Prime Minister did not like things to be runny, whether they be a pudding or presentation, although I would argue he would eat any pudding because he was a bit fat.
His poos are probably running.
Yeah. Yeah. And the way to prevent that is by cooking it up beforehand. So here's an actionable point for you. First, stop, think, and plan the PowerPoint you want to get across. In other words, what is the bottom line of your message? Focus on that first. Then you can reinforce your PowerPoint with examples and case stories. But first, work out your PowerPoint. The problem with most talks, presentations, and business conversations is that the would-be communicator didn't first plan his PowerPoint in his own mind before he prepared his remarks. Figuring out your bottom line purpose your first priority. Then meditate, formulate, and dictate to yourself that PowerPoint. And I mean, it all
Yeah.
makes sense. It's just like, having a bit of, once again, it comes down to preparation, which we've touched on so many times in all these, communication books, but just having a bit of an idea of like, what is the crux? What is the
Yeah.
purpose of what
What
I'm
do I
about
want
to
to
say?
say, basically? Yeah.
Yeah,
What is the bottom line of what message am I trying to get across, right?
exactly. Like there
And
may be so many other peripheral points that you want to get across, but what is the main thing? What is the purpose of,
yeah.
this conversation?
But that's what I love about the quote, or there are too many public speeches and too little
Yeah.
private thinking. Because he's kind of put he understands what it's all about. It's the fact that they haven't spent the time to actually figure out what it is they want to
Yeah.
communicate, and they end up communicating too many things.
And they're almost trying to figure it out while they're talking, which
Yeah,
they can't do.
exactly. Yes, yeah. So yeah, you can imagine Churchill would be pissed by that because he probably spends like we're saying, he probably spends a lot of time thinking about this stuff in advance.
Mm. Yeah.
So yeah, moving on from the PowerPoint. So I love when you're saying it then a couple of times. Like, oh my god, it's not the
I
Microsoft
know.
software.
I thought about it
He's-
at that time. I was like, I wonder whether that's why they like called it
they
not
called it
because of
PowerPoint.
this book,
Yeah,
but
it's a
because
shame.
just
Yeah, PowerPoints. I thought the whole sort of reputation of PowerPoints was that they're not necessary. People are always like, oh, you got too many slides or whatever. It's not. Anyway,
yeah, it's because they haven't read this
um,
book, mate. They don't know what the
that's
purpose
it.
is. You know.
That's it. So moving on to chapter 5, the power brief. The power brief is a technique to pack a punch in just a few words. The power brief is the epitome of conciseness, encapsulating an entire speech into a single compelling statement. This approach to communication isn't just about being brief, it's about being powerful. Whether delivered from a podium or discussed around a boardroom table, the impact of a crisp, clear message cannot be overstated. The adage, less is more, or adage, less is more, often associated with disciplines like architecture and fashion, equally applies to the art of speaking. This technique is leveraged by leaders from various fields, including presidents and preachers, to craft speeches that are as foundational as they are succinct. By being decisive in your words, you command attention and convey authority. So, quite a cool little example here, which I enjoyed. So, about as much he hated to spend money, President Coolidge hated to waste words. Once, after the president had attended church, a reporter had this conversation with Coolidge. What was the sermon about, Mr. President? Sin, answered Coolidge. What did he say about it? Asked the reporter. He was against it, replied Coolidge. And then another anecdote, sorry, that I really liked was a woman in a receiving line at the White House once gushed to him, Mr. President, I bet my husband that I could get you to say more than 2 words. You lose, was Coolidge's reply. Which just goes to show sort of
That's
how
great.
less is more. So yeah, surprise with brevity. So effective leadership often involves catching your audience off guard. If they brace themselves for a speech lasting 20 to 30 minutes, surprise them with a succinct 5-minute address. This approach is what you call a power brief. Conciseness is undoubtedly preferable to prolixity. Being succinct is far more impactful than being verbose. Moreover, brevity is memorable. Consider the most frequently recited speech of Churchill in its entirety. It's his brief address, lasting less than a minute, delivered during his 1941 return to Harrow School, where he was once a student with less than stellar achievements. At times, brief can say it all. For example, at the other club in London, new members are initiated by having to deliver an extemporaneous talk on a subject picked randomly from a hat. When it came time, for Churchill to be initiated, the chairman reached into the hat, pulled out a card that had one single word: sex. Churchill looked at the card and intoned in measured tones, "Sex. It gives me great pleasure." And Churchill sat down, which I thought was quite funny.
It's just I love this stuff. Bloody hell.
And then another great example from advertising, or it's one of the most impactful newspaper ads, is often a full page that hosts a single small sentence right in the middle. It's not the full use of the space that grabs the attention, but the strategic use of minimal space to make a significant impact. So, be incisive and sound decisive. And I really like that point, especially to be fair, one of the best parts of this book for me was all these little mini conversations from like Churchill and Coolidge and stuff like that, where you can really see these points being hammered home with great examples.
Yeah, no,
The best to ever do it, really.
Yeah. What's nice is that these are obviously points that we've come across, especially in for instance, the art of explanation. Being concise and being specific about what you're saying. But it's nice actually to have like examples, like quotes from people or like anecdotes, which just really hammer home the point. And like, so funny. It gives me great pleasure, buddy. What a boy. All right. So moving on to the power quote. Oh, I'm sure there will be some in here. Those who never quote are in return never quoted, by Benjamin Disraeli. The first rule, be comfortable with the quote. This is the first rule in power quotes. Don't refer to any author with whom you are unfamiliar or uncomfortable quoting. And then the second rule, prominent and pithy. So, which I actually don't know whether that's the right pronunciation, but I'm going to say
what, pithy?
Yeah,
I think it is pithy, but maybe not.
Is what it
That's
is.
how it is what it is. Where they get somebody can fact.
The second rule, which James Hume calls the general rule, is this: the name should be recognizable and the quotations brief. James Humes once heard a Philadelphia city councilman quote an entire paragraph from mega celebrity basketball player Michael Jordan in a talk to high school kids. After the first minute of Jordan's quotation, the councilman lost the attention of the high schoolers, even though the quote had been uttered by their greatest hero. One exception exists to the general rule. If you frame and stage a quote from an unknown, it can be effective. On the other hand, here is the short and telling observation. Good communication spells the difference between a leader and a manager. This quote is from Dr. Richard Eisenbeis, a professor of the management at the University of Southern Colorado. But whoever heard of Dr. Eisenbeis?
That's savage.
Yeah, I know. Fucking hell, that is. Had the same quote been credited to, say, Bill Gates, it would be not only pithy, but prominent. So here's an actionable point for you. Frame your quotes with gestures. So in 1901, the 44-year-old Roosevelt proclaimed a theme for his foreign policy befitting the nation's new status as a world power. Standing before his audience, T.R. paused in mid-speech to take out an envelope from his waistcoat, and then, with his pince-nez spectacles held in place, he focused on the envelope and intoned in his high, choppy voice. Thing is, I don't even. I want to do it, but I actually don't know what he sounds like.
Speak softly and carry a big
There is
stick.
an old African saying: "Speak softly and carry a big stick." In other words, he framed the anonymous quote like a picture and hung it out for everyone to see. He cited a quotation that is still remembered and credited to Theodore Roosevelt a century later. Speech is theatre, so dig up one apt quotation and frame it with props. And I think that's really good, especially the idea of giving it a visual element. You know, the more you give it, the more emphasis you give it, the more kind of sensory, visceral language, then the more people can engage with it and take it in, you know.
Yeah, it also makes it seem like it's really important. Like the fact he whipped out his sort of like monocle or glasses, whatever it is, and had to really focus on this envelope to read it out makes it seem
Power
like
pause,
it's really important.
right there as well.
Exactly, it's a mix of the power pause, but also with props to allow you to I've just picked this. It's so weird though to think, I'm just gonna pull something out an envelope and read it out loud, just the one line. But you can understand why people would be fixated on that one point, because it's the point where like you said, theatre.
Yeah.
It's the thing where it gets the most dramatic, I guess.
Absolutely. And having the contrast between other points in your speech that may not be as dramatic, so that when you do deliver it, people realize that this is an important part of the speech,
Exactly.
So dramatize to emphasize. Dramatize and emphasize your quote to make it a power quote. Quotes can wield power. A speaker who drones on at the same tempo and in the same register of voice may find his listeners' interest waning. But a quotation in the middle of a talk is like a baseball pitcher's change of pace. A quotation arrests the audience's attention. It wakes them up. It energizes them. But remember, use only one quotation per speech and dramatize it. Stage it, perform it, act it out. Put power into your quotation. You can do this by preparing your chosen quote by printing it onto a 3x5 card, then scale it down to the size of a business card and laminate it for durability. When the moment is right in your presentation, gracefully retrieve it from your wallet or purse. To give your quote an impactful delivery, consider adopting a distinctive accessory for reading it. For example, if you don't normally wear reading glasses, take out a pair of black-rimmed glasses with round lenses, similar to those Winston Churchill wore. You can have plain lenses if you want. From your lapel pocket. Donning these glasses before reciting your quote can transform it into a memorable power quote, leaving a lasting impression on your audience. And once again, just all goes to show, the more effort you put into something, and like we've touched on before, the more interested you appear to be in something, the more interested people will be.
100%.
So here's an actionable point for you: cross quotemanship. So what could be more unexpected than quoting one's political opponent to support your own ideas? Cross quotes enhance credibility. In the 1960 presidential campaign, James Humes amassed a pile of quotations from Democrats like Eleanor Roosevelt, Dean Acheson, and Harry Truman, criticizing Senator Kennedy to support the Republican campaign. Using your opposition's quotes against them is a great way to one-up the competition. And that's just a cool little actionable point, isn't it? Like,
Yeah.
you would really have to make them, swallow their tongue if you quoted something that backed up your own point.
100%. It reminds me of the Win Every Argument.
Yeah.
When we discussed that, because he talks a lot. It was less specifically quotes, although it was kind of quotes. It's just more like what has this person said in the past.
Yeah, like knowing their kind of point better than they do.
Yes.
But in this case, it's like,
but and also seeing what they've said in the past about specific topics. Obviously, people do change their mind on certain things, but being able to bring up a quote they've said, saying like, "This is my stance on something," and being like, "But this is what you said last year." You can't really come back from that.
It'd be pretty
basically arguing with yourself at that point, right? Yeah.
Create a quote file. Initiate the habit of compiling a collection of meaningful quotes. This practice can significantly enhance your speeches or presentations. Prior to your next engagement, sift through your collection to select a quotation that not only complements your data, but also emphasizes your key point. Jess, I think you're ahead of the game on this one.
Yeah, what is in having a quote file? Yeah, no, I actually got it from this book. I'm pretty sure.
I think you go the extra step and you have a quote database. I mean, that's the thing. And on Notion, that's what you got to do.
That's it. Slowly building it, but yeah, I like this. This was a good chapter actually. I liked it. There was a lot in it. So obviously with the the 2 different rules. Then the idea of dramatizing your quotes as well. I like that a lot. And framing them, and then the cross quotesmanship, and obviously creating a quote file. I think, in fact, if anything, one of the most actionable takeaways from that is the idea of just, if you come across quotes you like, make sure you save them and store them somewhere, because you might need to reuse them again in the future.
Absolutely.
And realistically, all these people who either have been quoted or they were quoting other people, and in my head they must have had their own sort of quote list. So whether or not they've learned it by heart or not, it doesn't matter. At least they've got it there prepared, so when they need a quote from somebody who's relevant, it's there available to back up their point. It just kind of makes sense. If your message, like, once again, if you've done the PowerPoint part and you know what you need to say, what better way to like give it some sort of credibility than finding somebody who's like a well revered and finding them with a quote about it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I agree.
So now moving on to number 7, which is the power stat. So when you read a statistic such as 123,411 new customers last year from a card or notes, you cite that precise statistic to gain immediate credibility. But when you add an explanation, such as, that means we have doubled our sales in a year, you ensure longer range memorability. A statistic, you see, is a numerical abstraction, which is the most difficult abstraction to etch into your listener's memory. The challenge for speakers is to present the statistic in such a way that the audience can grasp it. So here's a great example for you, to the moon and back. In 1958, the deficit of the United States had ballooned to $1 billion. For the first time, the US deficit had reached 10 figures. The astronomical statistic, however, was only an abstraction for Americans, a statistic that did not engage the senses, a number too enormous to assimilate and absorb. Eisenhower was searching for the graphic image of the $1 billion deficit that would resonate with Americans. He remarked to speechwriter Kevin McCann, "If you took $1 billion and put each dollar end to end, would it go to the moon?" So McCann called the Commerce Department and put their statistician to work on the measurements. In a speech weeks later, Eisenhower said this: "To understand the $1 billion deficit, imagine taking all the $1 bills in a billion and laying them out end to end. Why, it would more than go to the moon and back again." And that's just like the power of turning something that's
abstract,
hard to grasp, said abstract, and turning it into something that people really realize the sort of the size. And that's actually nuts if you really think about it. So $1 billion is going to the moon and back in lengthways. That's nuts.
I know. Imagine how many times we'd be going to the moon today.
Well, exactly. The trillion. Would it be reaching the sun? So move on to the next part. So you've got rely on or remember. When reading off numbers to prove a point, ask yourself what you are seeking: credibility at the time of your talk, or memorability that will stay in your listeners' minds for at least the next week. For maximum believability, cite one statistic as you would a power quote by pulling out a 3x5 card, putting on your spectacles and reading it. This guy loves spectacles. which I feel like it's probably dated now, and if you did it, people would just be like, "What?" There's got to be a way, obviously, you can dramatize what you're doing, and like pulling it from somewhere, I don't know, pulling up a newspaper report or
Yeah.
something.
Well, you could.
Um,
Yeah. I mean, pulling out your phone maybe might look a bit too distracted or
yeah,
something, but
yeah. I think there's just a lot of cynicism with politics these days that it would look too
yeah.
staged. Almost the stageness of it, people probably fight back a little bit. But okay, so now we're moving on to the 3 R's with statistics. So for any presentation or talk, you'll be wise to observe what James Hume calls the 3 R's of numbers. And the 3 R's of numbers are reduce, round, and relate. So the first part, reduce. So reduce your statistics. First, reduce the number of statistics you cite. Surveys show that one statistic is the most listeners without a pen and notepad can take away with them from a presentation. So rather than citing 2 statistics to prove the same point, follow Winston Churchill's advice about picking cigars. Pick the strongest and the finest. The use of 2 statistics confuses and confounds the listeners. The impact of the first statistic becomes muddled and muted when you cite the second. Then number 2, you got rounding.
Just on that point with the reduce your statistics, by having one, once again, it relates to that point that we've talked about in factfulness. It's like you don't know how the if there's one number standing alone, it can seem a lot, right?
Yeah.
And so you kind of want it, especially if you're trying to emphasize the number or the statistic in this case, having one. Although interesting, actually, you can use comparison to your benefit here as well. So you could introduce 2, but it's within the one statistic, if you get what I mean.
I think it's within the explanatory framework of like, so here's this like crime stat and here's this other stat, which helps you understand the 2 together.
Yeah.
But I feel like only if there's relationships between the 2 different ones you're talking about, and it makes sense to them to put it together, because then it becomes basically one statistic that represents the explanation. Or whatever.
Yes, exactly. I mean, like referring to the previous $1 billion example, you could say, we've got a debt of $1 billion, but then you could also say we've got a debt of $1 billion, which is twice as much from last year. And although that's 2 things, it's within the same.
It was 2 things but it contextualizes it, I guess, in a way that people. No, but you are right, because you don't just have to do it, like you said, with one stat. If it is also double as well, it probably makes sense for some people to grasp hold of that as the point.
Yeah.
That makes sense, because you are right. You could even be like, oh, we've gone from $1 billion to this amount, but it's like, but actually it's 5 times what we were last year. Then all of a sudden that makes it even more relevant and interesting, I guess. So so the second part then after the after reducing, we got round. So round your statistics. Second is rounding off the statistics you use. So the London Times on July the 5th, 2000 included these 2 lines. The British are purchasing 38,000 mobile phones a day. By the end of the year, 6 out of 10 British, including children and pensioners, will have their own mobile phones. If the article were to be delivered as a talk, 6 of 10 would be remembered a lot better than the statistic about how many phones are purchased each day. Rather than say 21.2% choose decaf coffee for breakfast, say 1 out of 5. We can easily remember 3 out of 4, 4 out of 5, or 7 out of 10. We also more easily remember fractions involving the first 10 numerals. We readily grasp 1 half, 1/3, 2/3, 1/4, 2/5, and so on. And that's quite a good point there as well. Just, I guess in some sense you're sacrificing a tiny bit of accuracy to be pinpoint correct with like the 21.2% or whatnot, but you're getting the overall picture sort of portrayed better in my head as well, because I do think personally, just with a thought experiment, when I think of the 2 differences, like 21.2% or 1 out of 5, the 1 out of 5 definitely just makes it seem I guess more human almost, because you almost compare it to 5 people in front of you, one person, whereas 21.2 just seems like just seems weird, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Yeah, no, I completely agree.
Then moving on to part 3, which is relate your statistics to your listeners. So the third R is to relate a statistic to a story. So sometimes all you have to do to find an appropriate statistic is to refer to your New York Times almanac. Ralph Nader probably did so when he rallied against big business, saying the entire country of Mozambique has 20 million people with 15 billion GNP, while Morgan Stanley has about the same GNP with 200 partners instead of 20 million sharing it. Speaking of billionaires, James Hume references a story that he heard about Andrew Carnegie, the Steel Baron. This is actually quite good. A man came to him and said, "Mr. Carnegie, you are the richest man in the world. Don't you think you should share some of it?" "Yes," said Carnegie. surprising the man. Carnegie then sent a note to his mail secretary, who appeared in a few moments with a check for the caller in the amount of 32 cents. That number was derived by taking Carnegie's wealth of hundreds of millions and dividing it by the population of the world. I thought that was quite a funny little story.
Wow, yeah.
Can you imagine? It's like, yeah, share your wealth to me. Okay, cool. Right, cut your check. Here's $5 or whatever. Or 32 cents.
Yeah, Jesus.
But yeah,
it's kind of funny that's Andrew Carnegie, because he's well known for being a philanthropist. But
yeah,
funny.
I also thought the story there about the GNP of Morgan Stanley v Mozambique was crazy.
That really, like,
what 20 million people share, 200 people share in a pot. But once again, it's technically not correct because they don't share it each. Yeah. But the point is, they like manage that amount between 200 rather than 20 million.
Yeah, it's crazy when you think some companies actually have more money than like a country.
In countries, yeah. So, moving on to another part. So, compare to the familiar. So, Henry Kissinger, the former Secretary of State, spoke to the Union League in Philadelphia in 1998. James Hume heard him say, "This is about the troubled area in the Balkans, Kosovo. Kosovo is about 5,000 square miles. In other words, about the size of Connecticut. 5,000 square miles is hard for any listener to grasp and process, but Kissinger's audience could easily picture the size of Connecticut." And then another example can be found when Vice President Gore skewered Governor Bush on his tax proposal, even though he used inaccurate statistics, with this line: "What will this tax cut give you? About enough for a working family to buy one can of Coca-Cola." Comparative statistics can surprise, even shock listeners, if the right comparison is found. Another example here is a speaker at a US National Chamber of Commerce meeting said this. I like this. "The Lord's Prayer has 66 words, the 10 Commandments 179 words, the Gettysburg Address 282 words. Do you know how many words are in the US government's regulations on the sale of cabbage? 26,911 words." And that is just a prime example of using comparative or comparing stuff to the familiar.
That's amazing.
Yeah. Some really good examples. The Connecticut thing meant nothing to me, obviously, not being from the US, etc. But the whole idea as well of like, what will this tax cut give you? It will give you a can of Coca-Cola. That's also a great one, because it makes people realize, wow, that's like nothing.
Well, it's relatable. You know, that's it. It's like people can actually imagine it in their lives.
Yeah, for sure. No, exactly. It just makes it. Well, once again, like we've seen all these other communication books, it makes it concrete. It's not just like a statistic. It's not just a number. It's something that people can actually imagine because they either drink Coca-Cola or have done in the past. So cool. On to the last part of the chapter. So don't use meaningless statistics. So a problem today's politicians face when they cite numbers as authority is cynicism from the audience. Many listeners believe the old adage, "Figures lie and liars figure," which does contain some truth. So if someone challenges you with some potentially incriminating stats, here's a light-hearted anecdote you could share. And I have paraphrased this because I couldn't take it all from the book, but it's something along the lines of, "I said to my granddad, who recently turned 80, isn't it fascinating that for every man who's reached the ripe old age of 80, there are 7 women?" To which my granddad quipped, "My boy, that has got to be the most pointless statistic I've ever come across." Which it was longer in the book, but that's the gist of it. So there are no doubt many meaningless statistics, but some numbers are noteworthy. Some figures can add force to your point, and the right statistics can tell a story that your listeners will believe and remember. It's all in your presentation, so reduce, round, and relate any statistic you use to make it a true power stat. And that's
that's a good chapter, I think.
Yeah, no, another good one, isn't it? Well, I mean, once again, we're rediscovering the same ideas in this book as we probably covered in other books, but it's giving really good concrete examples of it. But also at the same time, it's adding like little bits here and there. But we've obviously seen before the idea of taking something that's abstract, making it concrete. That comes across a lot, right? Because communication is all about both of you understanding what you're saying, and if you're putting it in a way that's hard to understand, such as an abstraction like a number, is a lot easier to reference something that people can actually relate to, whether it's the Coca-Cola can there or the Bible compared to the regulation of cabbage.
No, it's really good. It's really good. And just in that one example, the cabbage example, you've also got the element of humor, which is, something that we've touched.
Yes, yeah, 100%. Yeah, adds for sure.
All right, so moving on to chapter 8, Power Outage. Relying too heavily on slides can turn them from a helpful tool into a crutch for many executives, reducing the need to engage directly in speaking. Remember, a presentation should convey your personality and ideas through your voice and presence, not just through visuals on a screen. Let slides complement your message, not replace your role as the speaker. The true challenge lies in the direct interaction with your audience, something slides can't replicate. Embrace the principle that the tongue can paint pictures unseen by the eye. Emphasizing that verbal communication is key. Oh, I love that quote. That's good. Visual aids should enhance, not eclipse your speech. If a visual aid is too complex or diverts attention away from your message, it's better left unused. Effective visuals are simple, supportive, and self-explanatory, enriching your presentation without overshadowing your spoken words. So, slides, an appetizer, not the meal. A slide makes a greater appetizer or dessert, but not the whole meal. Visual aids should be a supplement, not a substitute for speaking. The display shouldn't deflect attention from the speaker, nor should it detract from the message. So, a key point here. An easy acronym, SLIDES, sums up James Hume's do's and don'ts for using visuals in presentation. So, S, slogan. Make the caption under each slide a slogan, a punchline, or a one-sentence phrase. Don't write an epistle. Is that how you say it?
I think that's the way James Humes loves big, juicy words like
He
that.
does,
That is,
yeah. I've heard of James Humes, but I actually don't know.
yeah. Epistle is a letter. I've just Googled
Okay,
it.
cool.
Yeah.
Lovely. Thanks, James. L, large. Put the print of the slogan in large caps. I, illustration. So keep the illustration, picture, or graph simple and uncluttered. And then D, directional. Don't use a directional stick or pointer. It's too distracting. E, erase. So erase one picture before you move to the next one. Otherwise, it detracts from your talk. If you have a series of slides, place black ones in between. And lastly, S, speech. Don't read your speech from a series of slide captions. Your audience can read. You are delivering a speech, not a series of introductions to slides. Great leaders like Churchill and Reagan didn't use slides, yet were among the most powerful speakers in history. Don't let slides become a crutch, lest you become a professional cripple. And yeah, I think it's a good point. I mean, visual slides, they're for a particular time and place, and because it's kind of, you can't have them all the time, don't become reliant on them, because then when you don't have a place where you can use them, then you're kind of stuffed a little bit because you've removed your crutch.
Yeah, it's also, I think it's quite interesting when you watch, it's going to be kind of like a semi-tangent, but at the same time it's not. When you watch people like Jordan Peterson teach their lectures on YouTube or whatnot, they don't, obviously they have slides there to help them, but they're actually talking without reading it. It just reminds me of my uni experience, which is like almost the opposite, where my uni teachers would just like have slides and they would just read from the slides, and you're just like,
I know.
why am I even here?
Yeah.
Like, but it's that type of thing. It's like they're there to accentuate and supplement what you're saying anyway, and you're meant to use it maybe there to remind you of what you should be talking about. But at the same time, it's not a substitute for like you're reading it word for word off the. Otherwise, you might as well just write an essay and get people to read it instead.
Yeah, I completely agree.
But yeah, so moving on to chapter 9, so we've got the power wit. So notice though that the title of this chapter is not power jokes. Instead, it is power wit, because wit suggests intelligence as well as humor. So part 1, which is don't tack on jokes. The difference between a joke and humor is the difference between a pornographic picture and a love scene in a good movie. A joke told for its own sake, without much relevance to the speech that follows insults the audience. Yet speakers continue to open their speeches with banal amenities, which are then followed by a trite joke. Aristotle once wrote, "The essence of humor is surprise. If that is so, why attempt to be funny when everyone is expecting it? Instead, sneak an amusing story into the middle of your talk when it's sure to provide some sort of comic relief. When you try to break the ice by rehashing a stale joke, you risk plunging into a chilly reception from your audience. Respect is the one thing an executive cannot afford to lose, and you will lose some if you tell a joke that others have heard before or don't find as funny as you do." Leaders don't begin speeches with stale old jokes, but they do spice up their talks with humorous anecdotes. So we've got here the 3 R's of humor. Make it realistic, make it relevant, and don't read it. So make stories realistic and relevant. Tell stories that are believable. Don't repeat those jokes you heard about a horse walking up to a Texas bar or the one about Jesus and Moses on a golf course. Anecdotes about the great and famous rate the best. It doesn't matter if your anecdote doesn't trigger gales of laughter, because a colourful insight into a historic personality is always entertaining. Churchill once observed, anecdotes are the toys of history. Since toys are fun to play with, try playing with some anecdotes to liven up your presentations. So this is one of the key points. So adopt an anecdote. The secret to presenting speech humor is to weave it in as part of your own experience. Abraham Lincoln, Benjamin Franklin, Franklin Roosevelt, and Ronald Reagan were all superb raconteurs, and they made their stories part of their own experience, even if it was secondhand. Lead them by the hand into your story by saying, for example, an old woman in the town I grew up in, or a lawyer I know once had a client walk in. When you find a story that fits the purpose of your speech, adopt it. It is now your story, something that happened to you or a friend of yours. Say it aloud and then close your eyes and tell it in your own words. And I thought this bit is quite interesting as well, because it reminds me a bit of where we see so much like political lying to some extent or whatever. So humor and poetic license. Don't worry about stretching the truth. You're not under oath. There is humor license as well as poetic license. So another executive, James Hume, cited a fictional classmate in this anecdote, and this is actually quite funny to you first. So I remember my high school biology class when Dr. Davidson asked Angela DiMarco, a transfer from a parochial school, Angela, what part of the human anatomy enlarges to about 10 times its normal size during periods of emotion or excitement? She goes, oh, I can't answer that question, the girl stammered, as she shyly avoided looking at the teacher. Then Dr. Davidson's called upon a boy sitting next to her. What is the human organ, Clark? Clark correctly answered, the pupil of the eye. Mr. Marco, said the professor, your refusal to answer my question makes 3 things evident. First, you didn't study last night's assignment. Second, you have a dirty mind. And third, when you marry, you'll be in for tremendous disappointment, concluded the professor. That's
great.
Yeah, I mean, it's probably not true, is it? Like you said, it is a poetic license, but it's a funny story.
That's so funny.
And going on to part 3 of the R's. So tell rather than read a funny story. So when sharing a humorous anecdote or story during your speech, it's far more engaging to recount it as if it's your own experience rather than reading it straight from your notes. The only time you should really consider reading it directly is if a specific written item, like a college acceptance letter or a newspaper excerpt, acts as a crucial element of your story, enhancing its impact. Attempting to read a funny story verbatim can fall flat in front of an audience. To avoid this, familiarize yourself with the story by practicing it out loud beforehand. We've seen this so many times, haven't we, about like practicing what you're going to say. So boil it down to the key phrases or bullet points, once again from The Art of Explanation, that will serve as cues. These cues will help you glance briefly at your notes for a quick memory refresh, allowing you to maintain eye contact with your audience as you recount the story, keeping them engaged and connected. And that's another link to The Art of Explanation there, with the whole idea of having bullet points as the sort of rough structure of what you're going to say and using it as a reference point rather than reading it word for word. It's kind of just points to jump in and out of.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So the last point from the chapter is ending or beginning with humor. So the humorous story can be the way to launch a brief 2-minute talk and can also be an effective way to end a talk. So wield wit like Churchill, be a raconteur like Reagan, make your anecdotes realistic and relevant, and be sure to tell it in your own words rather than memorize or read it. Glance quickly at your notes to jog your memory if necessary. Remember that the secret of humor, as Reagan once said, is to be entertaining while enlightening, and vice versa.
I think those are some really good, points to follow, the 3 R's of humor. I like that.
And I like the idea of, taking like anecdotes as well. And even like if somebody does pick up the book after listening to this, there are plenty of anecdotes even within this book about famous people like Churchill and stuff that you can use from the book.
You just need a jokes database as well as a quotes one, mate.
Yeah. But like even not, so they're not necessarily all jokes as well. They can kind of just, in fact, I guess it just depends if you define it witty sort of replies as jokes, which they kind of are to some extent. But yeah, there's plenty of examples in this book that you could take and have in your, like you said, like a database of anecdotes that usually have like a moral to it or whatever that you could just use
Yeah.
whatever. And if you, like you said, memorize a few of them, some bullet points. So maybe that's also one of the transformations you can do. You can have the list of the anecdotes, and then next to it, the list of the bullet points which represent the anecdotes. And that's, I'm going to actually write it down because I've just realized I can actually do that.
All right, so moving on to the next chapter. Chapter 10, Power Parable. Parables provide pictures of abstractions. God, that's a bit of a alliteration, isn't it? Parables provide pictures. Humanity is another such abstraction. For that, Jesus describes how a beaten up guy on the side of a road who looked like what we would call a homeless person was passed by several Jews. But then a Samaritan, not a Jew, but one of another tribe, was the one who stopped by to administer to him. Humanity in this story is personified in the Good Samaritan, now a widely used term for people who help others. Parables give pictures to abstractions. The power of parable is well illustrated with this story about President Abraham Lincoln, who looked like a sure loser for re-election in 1864. Meanwhile, Lincoln's best asset for winning was his experience as the incumbent president. But to say, I have experience, wouldn't work. Experience is an abstract word, ineffective without any picture to make the assets sink into the minds of the public. So Lincoln instead regaled his audience with the story of the Illinois farmer who wouldn't change horses in the middle of the stream. That single story rallied rural America behind him, and Lincoln won the election. And actually, that's a really good point. The idea of like making a more relatable story, you know, a politician is not representative of the normal population. But if you can recount a story or, you know, a parable,
But a story that also maybe means a lot to them as well.
exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. And really gets to depth of like, you know, what it means to be, in this case, probably like an average person, just like going about their daily life.
Yeah.
So turn concepts into concrete. Churchill, in his scaffolding rhetoric notes, said that an abstract idea goes in one ear and out the other, never establishing itself unless it is reinforced by a picture or story. Turn concepts into concrete if you want them to be understood and remembered. And this is a point that we've touched on multiple times, and I think it is just so important. So here's a key idea. Arsenal of anecdotes. James Humes, our friend James, finds parables so valuable that he let me start that again. Arsenal of anecdotes. James Humes finds parables so valuable that he's collected dozens that will fit almost any occasion or topic. He's not the only one. Benjamin Franklin was no speechmaker, but he had an arsenal of anecdotes with which to press home any point. He clearly had, you know, an anecdote database, didn't he, Jess? You could just tell. Sure. Benjamin Franklin had one. He was probably one of the first, you know, Notion users. Just, you know, created it. Yeah, he's ahead of his time. So, look back on your own experiences. Everyone's life is a story, is a storehouse of stories. One executive James Humes worked with told him that his bottom line message to stockholders was more research. To reinforce that idea, he told in harrowing detail about how his brother had almost drowned in an ocean undertow. The family his brother was visiting at the shore had failed to research the area and thus didn't find out about the nasty currents that always appeared in the afternoon. Another CEO wanted to talk to his company's internal sales force about being at the right place at the right time. So James Humes asked him how he met his wife. Puzzled, he asked, "What does that have to do with anything, Humes?" "Hey," James replied, "it's about being at the right place at the right time." And that's when the guy replied, "Well, I wish I'd never met her."
Can you imagine?
Kidding. It was the worst time.
And then I was doomed.
So a case story to communicate your point. Try telling a real life story to flesh out your concept. If, for example, you want to make the point that your company must anticipate and be responsive to change, you could illustrate this concept by comparing two giant 5 and 10 cent stores of the past century, Woolworths to Kresge.
Yeah, that's how I pronounce it.
Don't know what that shop is.
From America,
Past my time. Before my time. So pick out a business tale that will bolster your point. Check the backfires of the Wall Street Journal, New York Times business section, Fortune or Forbes for parallels to your own company situation. Then fit their story to your own marketing, sales, or research problem. Parable power is persuasive power. And it makes sense. Like, once again, you're just finding something that is more relatable for most people. Whether that's like a current affair or a story that most people know about. It's just, at least they will be able to, they have an anchor that they can apply your information to, and understand the kind of, like, in this case, an abstract point, but in the case of something that's relatable.
The whole power parable thing kind of reminds me a bit of like what people have been criticizing a lot of self-help books and a lot of business books, with that idea that a lot of them, what they just do is they have like one case study example and they create a whole point around it, and then each chapter is a separate point related to one case study, but it's not scientific in the sense that there's probably like a million case studies that disprove the thing that they've just claimed to prove. But I think the point here is that just goes to show how powerful they are, because people who read these business books, and I include myself in them, and I have done in the past, and I still do, I sometimes walk away from these business books being like, wow, it's such a great example of like how this affects your business or whatnot. Because realistically, only one example, where there's probably loads of counter examples with the whole survivorship bias, which you just never hear about because you never succeeded, right? But it's so interesting just how powerful that one example in detail can be to exemplify a point. And that's the point of it. It's like, in the sense, it doesn't have to be scientific. It just has to be like, do you have an example or a parable to explore and explain what you want to say? And then you've got enough to convince most people.
Yeah, exactly.
So yeah, we're moving on to the last one for this part. Then we've got chapter 11, which is the power gesture. Gestures say more than words. A gesture may be a signal from the soul that words cannot convey. An example of this is when Washington rode up from Mount Vernon to a group of officers. The old general drew out a prepared statement from his cloak. Then he took some spectacles from his pocket, love this, always the spectacles, and began, "Honourable gentlemen, I must apologise for my spectacles. My eyes have grown old in the service of my country." The officers had never seen him wear glasses before. This is the essence of a power gesture. I thought it was quite interesting as well. It's similar to the stuff before where you're dramatising the quotes, but this in particular, the idea of using it as a sign that, he's lost his eyesight from working so hard for the country or whatnot. So, the right signal at the right time. One gesture may be all it takes to get your point across. So Ronald Reagan defeated President Carter with the perfect gesture in his 1980 debate. After Carter attacked him, Reagan delivered his patented cock of the head with a smile and muttered, "There you go again." And another executive, James Hume, knew once opened a company meeting by pointing his finger like a pistol, aiming and firing 3 times. He followed up by outlining 3 ways they were going to kill their chief competitor: by lower cost, by better marketing, and by a new advertising campaign. I think that's pretty... Nah, that'd be too... I'd just watch that. Nah.
We do that on the show. So, chapter 12.
It's some knowledge. Knowledge number 1. Knowledge number 2. Right.
But it's interesting, the concept of, like, maybe by providing a physical behavior when you deliver something, then it allows, like, you're attributing more information for someone to remember that by. When you're when you're linking a behavior to the words that you're saying.
I think, particularly if it's a behavior that's relevant
and it's like simple
to what you're saying. Yeah. No, I think 100%. It reminds me exactly of what we spoke about earlier with the dramatization of like quotes. It's the same thing in my head. It's just doing something that makes people remember that specific thing that you're saying, and makes it, I guess, like you said, more impactful, because there's maybe more to remember there. It's not just them standing still with no sort of emotion. It's kind of like they've done something and it kind of reminds you.
Exactly.
I mean, the gun thing does make sense if you're talking about killing competitors and you start like pretending to shoot certain things. It does make sense. In fact, this next one is actually a really good example. So this is one of the key ideas from this chapter: finding the right demonstration of your idea. So sometimes it is not so much about striking the right pose as finding the right way to demonstrate your point. A woman executive wanted to highlight the cost of government regulation to a business dramatically. At a trade association breakfast meeting, she carried to the front of the table piles of huge sheets of paper tied with rubber bands. Then she dropped them on the table in front of her with a thud. After a pause, she announced, "These are the copies of all the regulations from the Federal Register. Some of them conflict with each other, but we have to comply with them all. these are taxes not only of our money, but of our time and personnel. And I quite like that as well. As like, if you've got a problem with the tax or whatever, or the regulations, being able to FUD a massive like pile of it and be like, this is what we have to get through. And they don't even they all conflict with each other. I think it's a useful demonstration.
Absolutely. Yeah, it just really hammers home the point, because you've got this additional kind of sensory information that's lending
100%.
to the words that you're saying.
Yeah, I guess therefore, if you ever have anything that's meant to be like large, heavy, or long, you just find something that represents it big and just drop it somewhere and be like, this is. I mean, obviously helps when it actually is the tax document. It's probably the tax documents on the cabbage, isn't it?
Yeah. Or, but like, you could do the same. This is a bit darker, but like, this is how many people have like died, and
oh yeah, 100%.
Really hammers home the point.
This is all their birth certificates or something. Yeah, sure. That's a really good really good idea. It's a really good idea to make people realize to realize the scale of some of the wars that have been happening.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Cool.
All right. Well, there you have it. That's the first part of Speak Like Churchill, Stand Like Lincoln.
Stand Like Lincoln. Correct. That's
That is it.
So
yeah, we covered the power pause in chapter 1, followed by the power opener. So opening with that really strong either story or statement, and only including kind of flattery halfway through to make it seem more genuine. Then you've got the power presence, so dressing appropriately, and maybe dressing in a particular way that's for you, but that people come to know you as dressing like that. And then you have your PowerPoint, like what is the purpose of what you're getting across, what is the crux of your argument. Then we moved on to chapter 5, so the power brief, so making things very concise and specific, not going on and actually thinking about what you're going to say. Then we have the power quote, and obviously not plural, just including the one, and not too complicated. And then we have the same for power stat, so only including the one and making it a bit more relevant. We've got the 3 R's there, so reduce your statistics, round your statistics, and relate your statistics to your listeners. And then we moved on to chapter 8, which is power outage. So, don't rely on visual cues or slides, just use that to help you get across and, complete your speech. And then chapter 9, so including wit, which is super important, especially if you want to be like Churchill. And you have the 3 R's, so make it realistic, make it relevant, and don't read it. And then we moved on to chapter 10, so the power of parable, so using relatable stories, realistic stories that people can actually genuinely understand your point. And then just now we touched on power of gesture, so using kind of either physical movements or sounds or additional kind of sensory information to really hammer home your point in the words that you convey as well. So yeah.
Oh, that's part 1. Yeah, part 2 will be covering a few extra things. So for those who were listening at the beginning, there are 2 of the 5 things we mentioned you will be learning. So we've got the Churchill's Cream framework, which will be coming up. We've also got the turning prose into poetry using a simple hack, and there's many more power tactics and tricks to come up. I think another 10 or another 9 or something like that.
Yeah. Cool. Looking forward to it.
Cool. That's a wrap.
That's a wrap.